Hi, I'm Jacqueline.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
We have two Courtneys here with us today.
Yeah, somehow I got logged in twice.
It was a little eerie. Courtney's like on the Zoom call, and I'm like waiting for her to pop up, and her video is not on yet. And then I get another like notification, and it's like Courtney wants to join. I'm like, Courtney's already here. Who is? Okay. So,
Yeah.
I didn't really know what I was getting into, but thankfully it's just the one Courtney. So don't have to worry about that.
And Mike, I should have taken a picture because my computer did freeze and you were making a very confused face. And all I remember is me being like, why are there two of me? Before realizing like I was frozen and had to restart my computer. It was a
Yeah,
mess.
it was.
Y'all, but you know what? I'm here. I merged back
Yes,
together.
Courtney she had a split personality thing going on, but she's kind of come into one now. Hold on. So the zipper on my jacket kept hitting my chair, and I was like, "Oh no, let me adjust this before you guys hear it throughout this entire episode." Because I am not someone who can talk and not use my hands and my whole body. So I gotta make sure you guys don't hear a ding, ding.
I'm trying to be a lot better about that because I still hear the occasional mic bump on my
Mm-hmm.
end. Um, so I'm
I
trying
try
to
to
be
like
better. So I'm trying to put my hands underneath my butt.
I cannot currently because my nails are wet because I just painted my nails while Courtney and I chatted before we started recording. But I always try to like sit back away from everything and just be conscious of like not touching anything else. But my hands are still. I try to keep them going. I wish you guys could see the movements I'm making right now. Wow,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, I don't know. It's just I have to be close so I can see the screen. Old
mm,
people problems.
that is a good point. Yeah.
Well, we don't really have too much in the case of updates this
Mm-hmm.
week that we know of. I'm sure there's something out there in the world, but honestly, my head's just been in the sand and I've just been surviving at this point. So I don't
Yeah.
really know what's going on in the world.
Yeah, we've been a little busy with life and things. And I was also, before we started recording, I was trying to think of what my perk of the week is going to be because we literally just recorded last week's episode 48 hours ago. And in those 48 hours, I've just worked and, took care of my kid in the
I
house.
made Kevin pick mine.
Oh, that's a good choice.
I was like, what is it going to be? Because I was just in a mood earlier. It's been a day, y'all. And I was like, literally, just tell me something to say.
You're like, I have no perks of the week. Nothing
You
good
know, when you're
happened.
just in those, when you're just in that mood, and especially, I'm sorry, men, but especially women, like the week before your period, and just
Hmm.
like, you kind
Everything
of
is just
also my
annoying and
eye keeps twitching, I think because
ugh.
I'm so stressed.
Yeah.
And it's just like you're just in those moods where you're just like everything sucks. And it's
Hmm.
sometimes hard to get a perk when
Yeah.
you're in those moods. And you recorded 48 hours ago.
Yeah, because you're like the last 2 days have not. I mean, like not that they've been like completely horrible, but it's like, has anything extraordinary happened that's worth mentioning? Um, yeah, and it's also funny how like the second your period starts, then your mood is. I mean, and you're like, oh,
Hmm.
that's what it was. Like, oh, that makes
Yeah.
sense. It's
Yeah.
like literally like the world is ending, and then you're like, oh, nope, nope, nope. It's just hormones. We're fine.
I also have been getting extremely anxious the
Mm,
week before my period, in addition to like
interesting.
moody. It's
Yeah.
very weird. Basically, my stomach is in knots for the whole week beforehand because I'm just like, anything that happens feels like a 10 out of 10 and the world is
Yeah.
ending. So maybe I should talk to a doctor about that. Anyway,
Maybe a therapist could just kind of help you.
I can't afford therapy. What are you talking about? Oh my gosh, this makes me think. Okay, I do have a funny story. So, at work, there's me and like two other girls who like we have our own little group chat where we just kind
Mhm.
of, not talk smack, but talk smack
Yeah,
basically and
we all
goof
know.
around. And we just had a horrible meeting today and one of them was like, this is why I upped my antidepressants. And the other girl was like, I need to be on antidepressants, but I can't get any more fat. I have a wedding coming
Oh my
up.
God.
And I just like died
Oh
laughing. Like we were
gosh.
just, oh, it was
You
so
guys are just a
funny.
mess today. Also, if
We're a
we
mess.
if we had a BetterHelp sponsorship, this would be a great place to insert that ad, but
Oh my
we
God, would
don't.
it?
So just go pay full price or find another
Yeah.
podcast that has a sponsorship.
basically every
boy.
podcast except us has one at this point.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We could get an Instacart sponsorship, but you have to people actually have to sign up using your link for you to get anything. And then I feel like that wouldn't actually happen. So I feel like we would just waste a bunch of time talking about Instacart. But anyway.
Especially because everyone has Instacart at this point. Like,
yeah.
Who in this life has not used Instacart?
Like, who of our small portion of listeners is like, wow, I've never used that and I will use it just because you guys told me about it.
I guess we could get Kevin to use it. Because I always just use my account.
Maybe we'll look into that off mic and in our planning sessions, which,
are just the podcast at this point.
Yeah, exactly. That just happens live and we just roll with it. And oh boy, we're going off the rails. I'm so sorry, guys. Okay.
All right, we got to go because by the end of this episode, my eye is going to twitch so hard I can't even see anymore. So let's get it going.
So if we need to turn this, into an espresso and I read the whole thing, then, we may have to do that because Courtney's just stumbling over all of her words. So
it's okay. My right eye is my good eye.
Just close one. So our sources today include a book called Murder in Pleasanton, Tina Faelz and the Search for Justice by Joshua Sushan. I hope. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. An article from Pleasanton Weekly, a CBS News article, and an episode of Cold Case Files called She Never Came Home. So Pleasanton, California is a suburb of the East Bay region of the San Francisco Bay Area. So it's like a mid-sized town with a population of about 80,000 in 2020. So in 1984, many considered Pleasanton a safe town. Residents would leave their doors unlocked and their windows open. Children roamed the streets playing with their friends until after dark, and no one worried about them.
I feel like, how there's drinking games for TV series. I feel like there needs to be one where it's anytime our podcast mentions a small town that people left their doors unlocked and no one worried about anything, because that's been every episode we've done recently.
Yeah. And then it's oh, and then they started worrying because this happened. And so there were actually only 5 murders in Pleasanton from the mid 1940s to 1984, which is 45 years and only 5
That's
murders.
Crazy.
Yeah. 5. And none of them were children either. But the brutal stabbing of a 14-year-old girl on her way home from school would change this idyllic image of this little town and would rock this community. It would also take almost 30 years for her killer to be brought to justice. On April 5th, 1984, a trucker was driving down the freeway in Pleasanton when he saw someone lying on the ground in a drainage culvert. So he's worried someone was hurt, so he took the next exit and got back on the freeway so he could get a closer look. So basically, he's driving fast down the road and he kind of sees it out of the corner of his eye and was oh wait, something didn't look right there. So then he had to get off and get back on the freeway, to get a closer look, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I feel they need to explain that because I feel if you're driving by somewhere, you can easily just pull over and stop. But it was, he was going fast, so he only saw it in his peripheral vision.
Quick glimpse, yeah.
Yeah. So when he came back around, he stopped his truck and he approached the person and noticed that they were covered in blood. So he immediately got back in his truck to go call for help. Obviously, this is 1984, so there weren't cell phones around, so he did have to leave and go find somewhere to call 911. And around the same time, some teenagers were walking home from the local high school and they discovered the bloody body of one of their classmates, 14-year-old Tina Faelz. So they also left to go home and call police. So 911 actually received the 2 calls within seconds of each other at 3:27 p.m. So Detective Craig Veteran heard the call and he was nearby, so he was the first to arrive on the scene. But he wasn't really familiar with the area, so he had to search around a bit to find the body. And when he did find Tina, he immediately checked for a pulse, but unfortunately she was gone. She had been stabbed repeatedly, and her backpack included several books and papers with her name, including a report card dated just that week. So detectives were now tasked with notifying the family of Tina Faelz about their daughter's horrific murder. So Tina was born on April 27th, 1969 to Ron Penix and Shirley Griffith. So Ron had moved to San Francisco from Washington State when he met Shirley working at the donut place. So they quickly bonded and she moved with him back to Washington State, and the couple got married in 1968. So most of Shirley's family had not even met him at this point. They got together super quickly and got married, and they really didn't even know each other super well. They did get pregnant quickly, but after Tina was born, Ron's alcoholism worsened, and Shirley left on a bus back to San Francisco with Tina when she was 1. So once they were back in California, Shirley reconnected with a high school flame named Steve Faelz. And their first date was at the San Francisco Zoo with Tina, which I thought was just super sweet that, like, you're going on a date with this single mom. And it's like your first date is like taking her daughter to the zoo together, you know?
That is sweet.
So they moved in together a few months later, and Shirley's divorce from Ron was finalized in 1971. And then shortly after that, Tina and Shirley were hit by a car while crossing the street, and Tina was severely injured. So she had surgery on her foot and actually spent several months in a full body cast at Stanford's Children's Hospital. But thankfully, she did make a full recovery. Which, like, I don't know exactly how old she was at that time. It didn't say, but she was between 1 and 4 years old when this happened to her, which is just horrific.
Yeah.
So Shirley married Steve Faelz in 1973 when Tina was 4. And Tina didn't really have a relationship with her biological father at all at this point. Like, I think he came down once to see them after they moved, and then he just kind of was doing his own thing, and he had a lot of alcohol problems and stuff. So he wasn't really involved, and he did allow Steve to adopt Tina and change her last name. So Steve worked for Castro Valley Fire Department. He was a very loving father. And on November 27th, 1975, Shirley and Steve had Tina's little brother, Drew. So the family of 4 moved to the fairly new Valley Trails neighborhood in 1976. So it was a nice community with good neighbors and like a lot of children for them to play with. Tina would like ride her bike to the movies with her friends. Again, like this is the time where everyone was just like, kids are out hanging out in the streets, you know. They didn't think they had a lot to worry about. Tina also played soccer, softball. She was in the Girl Scouts. She was described as very funny. And shortly before her death, she did complete an assignment for school about her future goals. And she said that she wanted to go to Chabot College and be an actress or maybe a real estate broker. Again, she was 14 when she died, so she's still like dreaming up like, what do I want to do? And like, what are my options? And like at that age, you literally think you can do anything, you know? And her mom, Shirley, did start working at the 7-Eleven in the neighborhood, so everyone there like really knew her as well. Like she was well known in the area. So Steve and Shirley separated in 1982 because Steve was having an affair with Shirley's brother's wife. And they actually got married after Steve and Shirley got divorced. So basically, Tina and Drew's aunt became their stepmom, and then their first cousins became their step-siblings.
That is way too complicated.
Yeah. And they did say in the book that family functions were described as very awkward after that, which I can imagine. So Steve did fight for joint custody, but he only got his children every other weekend and then for 2 weeks during the summer, which I feel like is very common for fathers, especially at this time. So Shirley did work a lot to make ends meet as a single mom, and she was also really struggling like with the divorce, like personally. So she would go out drinking at bars a lot after work, and then Tina was often responsible for looking after Drew. The two were frequently alone, and Tina would help Drew with his homework after school and then put him to bed when Shirley was gone. And then to make extra money, Shirley also started renting out an extra bedroom in their house for extra income. And Tina did struggle a bit with starting high school. She was described as like having trouble fitting in socially. She would also like pull pranks on people a lot. And like some of the other students didn't really like her because of that. Like they're like, you're kind of annoying. Like, why are you, doing this? And then other people are like, she just didn't really know like how to make friends. And that was kind of her way of like breaking the ice with people. So, some people found it funny and they became friends. And then other people like did not like it and really just didn't like her because of that.
Yeah.
And she did start being bullied to the point that she stopped wanting to ride the school bus. So Shirley started taking her to school in the morning, but she was often late getting home from the bars. Like she's like getting home at the time that her kids are getting up to go to school. So then Tina would end up being tardy to school. So Tina then started walking home from school through a neighborhood shortcut in the drainage culvert when her mom wasn't able to pick her up. So on April 5th, 8-year-old Drew Faelz arrived home from school around 4:45 and thought it was odd that Tina wasn't home yet. So she was usually there before him. Remember, she would like help him with his homework and stuff like that. So he did start riding his bike around the neighborhood. And when he came back home, there was a police car at his house. So he's like, I immediately knew that something was wrong. So the police asked him if he had like any friends in the neighborhood that he could go stay with for a while. So they escorted him over to their house. And then Shirley arrived shortly after 5 p.m. And detectives did tell her that her daughter Tina had been found murdered. So the lead detective for crimes against persons in that area was Gary Tollefson. So he took photos of the crime scene and started collecting evidence. So they did attempt to collect fingerprints, but it was like this just big outdoor area. So like fences and gates nearby were really the only things that like could show fingerprints, but they weren't able to get anything like usable that way. But police did notice that Tina's purse had been like suspended in a tree above her body, like it had been like tossed up, like hanging from like a tree branch.
Mm-hmm.
So basically this like drainage culvert like ran under the freeway. Like it's, when they show a picture of it, it's like a big, like those big black plastic things. Like they have them at like playgrounds that kids can like go through, but they also have like the giant ones that are like actually used, you know, but like enough that you can walk through standing up. But it's like under the freeway, so it's super loud, like you can hear cars above you. And they said that like at a certain point in the middle, like it's completely black, like because it's like a curtain, like you can't see anything in front of you or behind you. But it was a well-known shortcut from the school to the neighborhood where Tina lived. So a lot of kids would frequently walk through that way on their way to and from the high school. They actually said that they used to like walk like along the freeway, and basically like the police had to call the principal and be like, you got to get these kids off the freeway. And then they started like walking, you know, underneath, which they thought was safer. And they thought it was like unbelievable that someone would commit such a heinous crime in the middle of the day, like in an area that didn't really have a whole lot of cover, that usually had a good amount of foot traffic. Like you're by the side of a freeway, it's 3:00 in the afternoon. They're like, this just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So the coroner report noted that Tina had been stabbed 44 times, and she was alive until around the 38th wound. So like, so like she suffered a lot. Some of her wounds were like 5 inches deep, and again, 44 times. Like, I just can't even stress enough how brutal this murder was. And they did believe there was no like hilt or guard on the knife. So if you think of like a normal knife that you would use where there's like a handle and there's something that kind of like stops it. So like there was no like marks or like indentations on the body. So they're like, we think it's pretty likely that the killer would have cut themselves as well, because like we talked about this before, but like a knife being so slippery with all the blood, and then you don't have any like guard or anything to stop it. They're like, it had to have like slid down and cut his own hand. So the coroner's report also said that Tina had not been sexually assaulted. So Detective Robert Fricoli was sent to Tina's high school to ask about Tina. So he received her records from the admin office and spoke like with the students and the teachers who were there that day. And so this day was like an unusual spring day because the marching band was in Orlando and most of the school sports were playing games like off campus that afternoon. So there were like a lot fewer students around after school than there normally are. And Detective Fricoli did find out that Tina was being bullied and that some girls had threw rocks at her earlier in the day, but they did quickly learn that those girls were in detention, so they couldn't be responsible for Tina's murder. They also learned that Tina was supposed to be in detention that day as well, for all of her frequent tardies from being late getting to school, but she had skipped it. And it is speculated that she skipped detention because she knew the girls who had been bullying her would be there as well, and she wanted to avoid them. But for unknown reasons, Tina did stay outside the school for like 20 to 30 minutes before walking home. So when you're like comparing the different witness statements from that afternoon, they're like, you know, she was here at this time and then when she was seen here. But it seemed like she just like waited like 20 to 30 minutes. They don't know if she was like waiting for someone. Some people thought maybe she was waiting to make sure that those girls were really in detention before she started walking home because she didn't want them to like follow her. So not completely clear on that. But because the witness statements did track her movements that afternoon, they did have a pretty good window of when the murder had to have occurred. So half of the police force's 48 officer workforce was assigned to Tina's case. So you just have this massive number of officers who are working this case. And a grid search was set up to look for the murder weapon, but it was never located. And the community remained scared because they just had no idea who had committed this horrific act, like if someone else would be next. Her brother Drew was also traumatized, like obviously for the same reasons. And he remembered his mom having to sit outside his door at night until he could fall asleep. Steve Faelz was very angry because he felt that he could have provided a better home environment for Drew and Tina. And he did suspect that one of the men who rented a room from Shirley was responsible for this. So he did tell that to police. So he's like, you know, she's renting out this room to like strangers basically for extra money. He's like, it had to have been one of them. So he let them know that that was his suspicion. And many in the community also suspected the truck driver who found Tina, because they're like, oh, this random person just driving down the road happens to find her. But his work logs and like his drop-offs for that day, like where he was when, all confirmed his story of what happened. And they like even got in the car to drive like the exact route that he said he did to see if the timing lined up, and everything did. So high school students Steve Carlson and Todd Smith said they were riding in a car and saw Tina shortly before 3 p.m. headed towards the drainage culvert. Steve also remembered that Tina like gave him a dirty look. He's like, maybe I was like driving too fast through the neighborhood. Like he's like, I specifically remember seeing her because she kind of like glared at me. So like that's why it stuck out, in his mind. And Shirley's boyfriend, Keith Fitzwater, had recently moved out of their home due to some family conflicts, but he was still staying over like a few nights a week. He's actually 15 years younger than Shirley and in his early 20s, so not much older than Tina. He was a heavy drinker and drug user. He had been violent towards Shirley and had a bad temper. He also had previously been seen yelling at Tina to leave her mom alone. And Tina had also told her mom that one night she woke up to Keith in her bed with his hand under the blanket on her leg. But Shirley didn't believe her, so she refused to kick him out. But then at other times, Tina told her friends that like she was in love with Keith. So many authority figures saw Tina's behavior as just a product of her unstable home life. They're like, she just really craved attention because she wasn't getting it at home. So like, we don't really know if either of these stories are true, if both are true. I mean, she's a young girl. She's probably feeling a lot of things and confused. And it doesn't mean that both of those things couldn't have been true, So Tina's aunt told police about Keith's behavior, and they looked into him. And he told police he was at work when Tina was killed, and he asked his boss for a ride to Shirley's house when he found out about it. So he did have a knife on his belt at the time and gave it to his boss in the car and asked him to hang on to it. He said that he didn't want to go into the house with a knife. So this was like a huge red flag. So police were able to get the knife and they analyzed it, but it didn't have any traces of blood on it. And his timeline did also match like what his boss said and confirmed that he was at work from the time Tina got out of school until her mother was notified of her murder, because he was notified after Shirley was. And he basically was like, I just didn't want to enter Shirley's house with a knife, given the manner in which her daughter had just been murdered, which I'm like, I can understand.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Like that could be triggering, being like, we found your daughter stabbed to death. And then you're like, oh, here's my knife.
Yeah. Like, oh, I show up like with this knife on my belt. Like, I can see how you would be like, oh, maybe I don't want to upset my girlfriend whose daughter was just murdered. Like, can you just hang on to this? But I can also see where that would be suspicious when you're investigating the murder.
I'm also thinking too, like, so many people act in such like impulsive ways, like after hearing. So like, if she did think that maybe he was responsible or someone there was responsible, she could grab that knife and use it on someone there just because she's acting out of rage. So I'm like, I can understand his point of view, but if other people are like, it's him, like, you got to check it out.
I mean, not to mention too, like, is she feeling suicidal at this point? And he's like, I don't want to have what could be a weapon in the home, especially because if he's planning on like staying there overnight, I mean, you're not going to want to like walk out in the middle of the night and hide your knife so she doesn't have access to it. So it's like, it makes sense that you would just ask your boss, hey, can you just hang on to this? But, I get it being a red flag. So while interviewing students and teachers at Tina's high school, they did learn that there was like a lot of drinking that went on among the students, even like on campus during the day. Like they would just have their like 7-Eleven cups like full of vodka, just like wilding it out over here. They even had like a designated smoking area on campus like for the students, which I'm pretty sure our high school had when my brother graduated, which was 2003. So I'm pretty sure that was still a thing then. And I think that ended before we came. Not that it was like necessarily a designated smoking area for students, but it was just a designated smoking area that like students were allowed in and wasn't like.
I know when my dad went to school, he would always talk about like they had designated like smoking areas for students, basically.
Yeah. So in addition to the students who were bullying Tina, other students had also put Steve Carlson in a dumpster earlier in the day Tina died. So they did turn the dumpster over and he was stuck inside for like 10 minutes before a teacher let him out, which is horrifying. And the teacher reported that Steve smelled like alcohol, and other students said that they had been drinking at his house with him like during lunch. So like there's just like a lot of like shenanigans and wild stuff going on at the school, apparently, which I mean, it's the 80s. So, you just walk home on your lunch break and do a few shots and go back to school, I guess. So while interviewing students and teachers at Tina's high school, they did learn that there was like a lot of drinking that went on among the students, even like on campus during the day. Like they would just have their like 7-Eleven cups like full of vodka, just like wilding it out over here. So when police interviewed Steve, who reported seeing Tina shortly before 3 p.m., they noticed that he had a cut on his finger. So at first he told police that he dropped a pan at work and cut himself, but then he later said he cut it while replacing a vent hood at work. But he did say he didn't tell his boss about the incident, so there was no workplace incident report on file. Several girls had also reported that Steve had groped them, but there was no other evidence pointing towards him having anything to do with Tina's murder. And his friend Todd also confirmed that he was with Steve that afternoon, and they had seen Tina walking towards the drainage culvert together.
And on April 26, a man named Walter Nyman sexually assaulted a 17-year-old girl in Felton, California. He did attempt to kidnap her, but she was able to get away. Police also learned that he lived in Pleasanton a few weeks before when Tina had been murdered. So Walter had been there staying with his grandmother, and she said she clearly remembered April 5th because that was the day he showed up at her house. She said he appeared flustered, and police did find 2 bloody knives and bloody clothing at his home. But when they tested it, it was animal blood. So police didn't really have any other evidence or reason to hold Walter at this time. It was just like, okay, this is all suspicious, but nothing really pointing to Tina's murder. So Tina's family continued to struggle not only with her death, but not knowing like who had killed her and if this person would kill again. So the family decided to spread her ashes in Yosemite National Park. And when Drew was around 18 years old, he had to have Shirley committed to a mental hospital because she was in a deep depression and couldn't take care of herself or Drew. She also had a lot of physical health problems following Tina's death. So again, just showing, we always talk about just the impact on families after someone's murdered, and like, here is a prime example.
Yeah, definitely.
And in February of 2008, Detective Dana Savage was pregnant and was on light duty and unable to do field work. So for this reason, she started looking into cold cases in the area. Tina Faelz was one of them, and her file contained 20,000 pages of statements and notes. So Savage noticed that there had been 3 serial killers in the area in the 1980s with similar MOs to Tina's death, so she started looking into them further. So one of them was a man named James DeVeggio, who went to the same high school as Tina years before. So police interviewed him, and he denied having anything to do with Tina's murder. He said he was also in prison for the rest of his life anyway, so he would tell them if he was responsible. He's like, I'm not going anywhere. Why wouldn't I just tell you if I did it?
Yeah, and also he's probably like, I could probably get better privileges if I did admit to something that I didn't do. So like, yeah, I would tell you if I did.
Yeah. So he pointed the finger at his friend Walter Nyman, and detectives started looking at the forensics again to see if any tests could be done with new technology. So Tina's purse had previously been tested for fingerprints, but there were no results, and her sweatshirt had also been tested for DNA, but there was none. So while looking back at the crime scene photos, Savage started thinking about what the killer could have left evidence on. So the purse in the tree really caught her attention, and she assumed that the last person to touch the purse had been the killer because there would have been no reason for like Tina to toss her own purse up into a tree. Like, why would she do that during this violent attack? And she was also thinking about how it was likely the killer had cut his own hand, and she wondered if he'd left blood on the purse when he touched it. So she decided to take the purse and test it for blood and DNA, and it was sent to the FBI, where it would take years to be tested. We see this a lot, how long it takes.
I mean, especially for this case, which is how many years cold, 20 years cold at this point. It's not like, oh, we're trying to catch someone that we think is actively out there, even though, this person could be, but it's not someone that was killed yesterday and they're testing evidence. So it's going to be even more backlogged than everything else.
Mm-hmm. So on March 14, 2011, Dana Savage gets a call from the FBI. 4 drops of blood were found on the purse, and they were a match to a prison inmate whose DNA was in the system. And that inmate was 43-year-old Steve Carlson. So Steve Carlson was a 16-year-old student who went to school with Tina and was one of the last people who reported seeing her. He was the one that had been locked in the dumpster, smelled like alcohol the day of her murder. So Steve Carlson was born on December 29th, 1967 in Bakersfield, California, and he was the second of 4 children to John and Sandra Carlson. He had trouble in school, and he was later believed to have undiagnosed ADHD, and he also struggled with social skills and making friends. The Carlsons moved to Pleasanton for the 1980-81 school year. Steve was strong and good looking, but he wasn't very athletic. And all of his new friends just wanted to play sports. So this just kind of also led to him like having trouble fitting in. We know how cliquey high school can be. So if you weren't in one of those,
Yeah.
you struggled. Um, he was a neighborhood troublemaker and would often cheat during games with the other kids. He was picked on a lot, and many remembered him just being like a weird kid. And one classmate even reported that Steve killed a frog, and they asked him why, he said because he wanted to. And he would also tell classmates he wanted to fuck their mom, which I feel like it's something kids do now.
Yeah, that is
like
true.
maybe they didn't do it then, but I feel like kids, especially high school kids, like, and I feel like it really started with like your mama jokes. Really, that's what they went for. But that was probably unusual back in this time.
Yeah, that's true. And also, I feel like it's different when it's like a friend that's like messing with you versus this new kid who's like coming in who no one really knows. And like now he's trying to play sports with you guys, but he's cheating. And then he's like, oh, I want to fuck your mom. And you're like, I don't even know you. Like, who the fuck are you? Go away. Like, it's different from like someone you grew up with that you're friends with that you're just like, oh man, shut the hell up. Like, stop. You know, I just like it's a different kind of vibe, maybe. Still weird either way, but.
And one described his jokes as grotesque and crude. He once went to a friend's house and peeked in on her in the shower. So he did get the nickname Creepy Carlson because of his behavior. And he also supposedly looked his own sister in the shower and would later molest her. So a very creepy Carlson.
Yeah, not off to a great start here.
So Steve's parents were strict and expected their children to come home and do chores, but most of the time they didn't. So the house was just frequently a mess and they were grounded a lot. The Carlsons had only planned on having one child. And if you can remember, they had 4. So they were frequently like absent, like as their children got older. And they were actually frequently at the same bars that Shirley was at. And Steve would steal his mom's caffeine pills that she used for weight loss. And that's really where his drug addiction started. And he was doing meth by the time he was 16. And one teacher remembers breaking up a fight when Steve was involved. And he said it went beyond a normal teenage fight, with Steve just beating the other kid and like punching him repeatedly in the face. Like it went way beyond just your normal teenage fight.
Yeah, like that teacher was interviewed in the book and he was like, oh, you know, like these kids get in fights all the time, which, you know, we remember from high school. And he's like, I would never like run to break up a fight. He's like, I would just kind of mosey over there. I'm like, all right, guys, break it up. He's like, but this one was different. He's like, this one I had to like sprint there and like pull him off of him because it was way more serious than it normally is.
And a couple of teachers also reported that Steve's behaviors increased after Tina's death. He eventually dropped out of school and bounced around, staying at various people's houses in the mid to late 80s. He stole checks from his parents and cashed them, and he also stole his brother's coin collection. He stole a pistol from a friend's dad and tossed it while on the run from the police. And he briefly went to live with his grandmother, but that didn't last long either. And when Steve was 22, he went to prison for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old girl. So not a great guy.
No.
A lot of his friends would say he was clearly an alcoholic by age 18, and he would just frequently like pass out and pee on himself, which is very advanced stage, I feel like, of alcoholism. And to already be there at 18. So after he got out of jail, Steve married a woman named Justine Hamilton. And he'd frequently get into fights around town because people knew what he'd been in jail for, and he did have to register as a sex offender. So Justine got pregnant 6 months after Steve was released from prison, and their daughter was born in June of 1993. So Steve hadn't spoken to his family in years at this point, and he started beating Justine and wrecked her vehicles. He started driving her friends away as well. And the only member of his family that Justine and her family ever met was his brother. And that was only once at their daughter's first birthday party. So once Steve started doing drugs and drinking alcohol in front of their daughter, Justina just had enough and she finally left him. She called his parole officer and informed him that he'd violated his parole and had him arrested. So Justine and Steve got divorced in 1996, and Steve didn't end up getting hepatitis C from his drug use. So after his divorce, Steve met a young girl named Sarah Whitmire, and they got together when she turned 18, and she quickly got pregnant. So Steve's second child was born in February of 1997. And when Sarah woke up after giving birth, Steve had actually stolen the camera they'd used to take pictures of their newborn, and she believed he likely sold it for drugs. So she never got the pictures of her baby back, which is just a new low.
Yeah. That's just so devastating. And to know that the father of your child, the person who's supposed to be there to help you raise this child, literally stole that camera to sell it for drugs. And now those memories are gone forever.
And that's kind of when you know in someone's addiction that they'll do anything.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely,
pictures with your newborn baby on it. And you're like, that's money.
Yeah.
So Steve came back and she allowed him to move in with her. He tried to be a good dad, but drugs would interfere. One day, Sarah came home and there was a bag of meth on the floor that their baby could have gotten into. And this was just the last straw. So Sarah kicked Steve out for good. So Shirley was able to get a news article released in 2008 to draw up interest in the case and encourage someone with information to come forward. So the article was printed online, and several comments suggested looking at a student who'd been drunk at school that day, and a few even mentioned Steve Carlson by name. So in 2010, Todd Smith ran into Steve Carlson, who was living on the streets. They hadn't spoken in decades, and Todd didn't even recognize him at first. So Steve proudly told Todd that he'd been in jail for molesting a 14-year-old girl and then later for drugs, and showed him all of his tattoos. So Todd was uncomfortable and just didn't really speak with Steve for long. He's like, this isn't the ketchup I want. I'm going to leave.
Yeah. And he was there with his wife, and he's like, we're just going to go. And his wife was kind of who is this person? Because you know how it is when you meet someone that your significant other knows and they're not introducing you. And so you're trying to just oh, hi. And he's just kind of no, we're walking away. You don't want to meet this person.
Yeah. And in December of 2010, Steve was arrested for possession of meth and violating parole. And because of the current law, his DNA was collected and entered into CODIS as a result of that arrest. It would be 4 months later when the blood on Tina's purse was tested, and that's when they were able to match Steve Carlson because his DNA is now in the system.
Which is so crazy to think that if he had not been arrested at that time, and I'm not sure if the law still is. I know it's changed a few times in places on when they collect DNA for what types of arrests and when they don't or whatever. But it's if that law had not been in place, if he had been arrested right after they ran, because they're not going to keep running it. Once they run it and they're oh, well, we didn't get a match, then that would probably be the end of that. And there was also a very small amount of blood on the purse to be sampled, so it's not they could keep sending it off and retesting it. So it just blows my mind that just 4 months later is when, if it had been actually tested when they sent it off and it didn't sit there for 2 years, would they have ever gotten closure on this case?
Yeah.
Anyway, I just had to throw that in there.
Yeah. So the DNA alone wasn't enough for an arrest because detectives had to verify that the DNA in the system had actually come from Steve. So I do see Jacqueline's note about I don't understand this at all.
Do you understand this, Courtney?
I have a theory.
Okay.
And it's because human error, basically, that they could put in his DNA and put it under the wrong person, is what I assume. Is that they need to actually, because we kind of saw that in the Colorado Hammer killer case, his DNA matched, but they also were we have to get DNA from him to make it rock solid. And I think that's because I feel like a defense attorney could easily reasonable doubt if you don't compare those.
That makes sense, because I guess I had it in my head of oh, but when you do testing and the DNA comes back, but I feel this is a new wave of DNA coming back this way. Most of the time it comes back because you had a suspect, you got their DNA, you ran the testing, and it was a match to that person, versus running it against all the DNA in CODIS. And then, yeah, that makes sense, because I guess this is becoming more common, but it's not all the cases that you hear about currently. Because this was more
2011 too, where it's still pretty new. True, and that's the thing I think even today is just you guys know I work in background checks, and I see this shit that's literally on murder cases where the date of birth is wrong and the social's wrong, stuff like that.
That's a good point.
That's all I can think is just human error. If you're entering all these inmates' DNA,
Yeah.
you could accidentally slip up and get it wrong. So
That makes sense. Okay. Thank you for that.
maybe there's not it, but that's what I would think.
That does make a lot of sense. Yeah.
A professional can tell us if I'm wrong. But they did need to get like enough additional evidence to get their own warrant for Steve's DNA. So Steve was scheduled to be released on August 7th, 2011. So they knew they had to arrest him before then so he wouldn't like get away, because there's probably rumblings around town that they're thinking it's him.
Yeah.
So they started re-interviewing students and teachers from the high school. So investigators learned that the day of Tina's murder, Steve's parents had been out of town and he was alone in the house. He had invited some friends to his house to drink alcohol during lunch. It's unclear if students actually went or not, because their stories changed over the years, and that could just be forgetting, trying to distance themselves.
Yeah.
Who knows? But what's not disputed is that sometime that afternoon, a group of students did lock him in a dumpster. So a teacher got him out and did remember that he smelled like alcohol. So he went home and got his mom's car after that and started driving around. And Todd Smith had originally told police he was with Steve that afternoon, and they both reported seeing Tina walking towards the drainage culvert shortly before 3 p.m. And Todd originally said they stayed together that afternoon, but when he was re-interviewed in 1986, he said he went home to pick up his brother after they saw Tina, and he wasn't with Steve again until later that night. So his story also changed a little bit. So Todd Smith actually applied for a job with the police department in 1988 and had to go through a lie detector test as part of the interview. He thought the questions would be about the job, but investigators started asking him about Tina's murder. Little switcheroo.
They're like, while we got you here, Todd, if you don't mind, we just got a few more things to throw in here.
Which I do wonder how
legal that is. Yeah.
Legal.
Exactly.
Also, I'm like, I would start getting nervous too. I'm already nervous for this job interview, and now you're throwing in these questions.
Right. Which I'm guessing is why like nothing came of it then, because it's like, is that really admissible, you know?
Yeah. So he said at the time that he thought Steve Carlson would have been responsible. He said he didn't know why he had originally provided his alibi to police. And like at the time, he didn't think Steve had anything to do with it. So he's like, kind of then I was like, yeah, I was with him the whole time. I didn't think he could do anything, but I really wasn't.
Yeah.
It's his story.
Which I'm also just like, if you didn't think he had anything to do with it, why would you feel the need? Like, he wasn't a suspect at that point. I mean, he was interviewed, but like everyone in this entire town was interviewed. So why, if you didn't think he had anything to do with it, why did you feel like you had to lie and tell police you were with him when you weren't, you know?
Yeah, unless he was like making weird comments like after they saw Tina or something, and he's like, ooh, but
could be.
Still, like, how good of friends are you that you're gonna defend him? It's weird. So in the book, many students interviewed said Steve would admit to killing Tina at parties, but would then say he was just joking. Not a funny joke. And many students and teachers remembered him behaving strangely after Tina's murder. So he started failing classes and was suspended for being drunk or high on the school campus. So when investigators interviewed Steve from prison in 2011, he threw up as soon as they said they were there to talk about Tina Faelz. So, hey, there's your DNA sample. Just kidding.
Right. Which that part was in the Cold Case Files episode, like the surveillance recording from that interview. Basically, police like talked to him for like 45 minutes about like, you know, some of his other crimes and just like all this stuff. And then they're like, okay, well, like what we really need to talk to you about is Tina Faelz. And then like you see him immediately like gagging and like motioning for the trash can and they hand it to him. And so I'm like, that's pretty it's pretty damning.
That's pretty damning.
Especially like 45 minutes into this whole conversation, and then immediately when they mention her name, you have to throw up. It's like, I think you might have something to do with that.
So they asked for a DNA sample, but he refused. However, they had a warrant, so they were able to get his DNA anyway. And this testing also confirmed that the blood on Tina's purse was a match to Steve Carlson. Despite being 43 years old, Steve went to juvenile jail because he was 16 years old at the time of the murder was committed. Never fucking heard of this.
No, I had no idea this was a thing, that this was legal.
That sounds so unsafe.
Yeah.
This man who's gone to prison multiple times And you're putting him with like 16-year-olds?
I would assume, I would hope that he was like isolated and wasn't like with other
I would hope
juveniles,
so.
but who knows?
He's a sex offender. How can he even?
Right? This makes no
I mean,
sense.
I guess because they don't view those minors as worthy. But if he was near a school, they'd flip their shit.
Yeah, it is
Anyway.
insane.
So his attorney requested a behavior assessment before transferring him to adult court, just like what would have happened if he had been arrested when he was 16. So the judge ruled that Steve Carlson would be tried as an adult due to the sophisticated nature and severity of the crime and his other failed attempts of rehabilitation. So I'm sure even if he was 16, like they would have tried him as an adult. So
yeah, I mean, like 44 times. Like this is
yeah. So Steve Carlson finally went to trial for the murder of Tina Faelz in 2014. Unfortunately, Tina's mom, Shirley, died of a massive heart attack the day before the trial started. So, like, she's had to spend all these years and then dies right before the trial starts.
And like her sister, Shirley's sister, was interviewed in the episode, and it was like so heartbreaking. And she was like, she just died of a broken heart, and like after so many years. And she's like, I think he should have been charged with 2 murders because I think he is responsible for her death as well. And she also said like once they had gotten to that point that Shirley's like, okay, like I feel like justice is going to be done. She's like, I think she was just able to release. Like I said, she'd had all of these health problems and everything, and they're like, I think that was just the final straw for her.
Yeah. So the prosecution claimed that Steve got mad when Tina gave him a dirty look and he followed her into the culvert after dropping Todd Smith off at his house. So Steve's house had a view of the culvert, and witnesses testified to Steve sitting on the roof of his house and watching detectives work the crime scene the night Tina was murdered. Investigators believed he tossed her purse into the tree so that he could mark the spot for himself to watch once we got back home. So they think that was him marking it so he could spot it from his roof. So when Todd Smith testified, he was asked about the conflicting statements he gave to police over the years, and he said he didn't remember some of the statements, but did admit to lying to police about being with Steve because he didn't think he was a suspect at first. He said he did then tell police that Steve might be responsible, but there's no like official record of that in police notes. Many students and teachers also said they mentioned Steve to police back in the 80s, but there's no documentation of that in police records either. It's unknown if police intentionally removed this information because they messed up and had information about the suspect all along, or if people who had the information wished they'd spoken up or thought they had spoken up when they really hadn't.
Which I can really see both of those being likely scenarios, you know, like I don't know. I don't know which one it is, but I can see obviously the police are like, oh, we have this guy's name in here several times. We've spoken to him several times. Like maybe we need to remove, you know, a few of these. But at the same time, there were also 20,000 pages of notes in this file. So I'm like, would you have been able to remove all of the mentions of him? Or, you know, is it a case of these kids who were in high school at the time and, you know, 30 years later, they're like, oh yeah, I remember him talking about it at parties. Like I must have told the police that, but it's like, no, you didn't because you were 16 and dumb and you didn't want to get, not dumb, but you know, you're like, I'm not going to go there, but your adult brain thinks that you did and remembers it differently. Or you're like, oh man, like I really like should have. So then when I'm asked about it later, you're like, oh yeah, like I do remember. You lie about it because you don't want to say
or
you didn't.
Even like thought it. Like you were like, oh, I bet he's kind of suspicious, but you don't say it because you're like, well, what evidence do I have to just
exactly?
So he's like weird doesn't mean he's a murderer.
Yeah, I really don't know which of those is true, but I could see both of them being true.
Yeah. So Steve Carlson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 26 years to life. This was later changed to second-degree murder and 15 years to life on appeal. So Steve Carlson maintained his innocence until 2020 when he wrote letters to the state parole commissioners and Tina's family finally admitting to the murder. And just so you know, I don't think you can ever get parole unless you accept blame.
Yeah.
Also,
I was wondering about that too.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily like all him having heart.
Yeah, definitely.
So he wrote to Tina, I want you and your family to know you did absolutely nothing to deserve what I did to you. That's what makes this murder so callous and horrific. He went on to say he was drunk and angry after being tossed into the dumpster, and that's what led him to murder Tina. An anonymous friend of Tina's is interviewed in the book and reports that Steve was raping her and that Tina was aware of it. So she wonders if Steve was afraid Tina was going to tell on him, and that's why he decided to like murder Tina, like just found an opportunity, didn't want to get caught.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like that. And Steve Carlson is actually up for parole this year.
Yep.
So that is the absolutely horrible murder of Tina Faelz.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot of people because most of the town believes that he did it, but people for the defense team that are like, oh, like literally all you have is his blood on a purse. And I'm like, but it's his blood on a purse. It's not, it's not his spit or his, whatever. But they're like, oh, it could be a paper cut, a nosebleed or whatever. But I'm like, that's very convenient. Like that he would happen to get a paper cut near her purse when they've apparently never really interacted other than this encounter with the friend that he was raping that happened like outside of school. So what are the chances that like that day at school he happened to get a hangnail that bled on her purse, and then people also think that he's responsible, and he also admitted to it, and he also has no alibi, and just seems
he also puked whenever her name was brought up.
Yeah. He also went on to commit a lot of other crimes. Not to say that, if you commit other crimes, that means that obviously you did this other murder that you're accused of. But it's not like he led this like perfect life that. And that's what his sister, who's interviewed a lot in the book, like she doesn't think that he did it, but like she basically tells him like, well, it's your fault for everything that you did, that you're in this position. Which I'm like, which is an interesting perspective. I feel like I really don't think he did it, but like also you told people you did, and also you raped 13-year-old girls when you were an adult, and did all of these other things, and which I don't know how much of his crimes were just related to his drug addiction. I mean, he was doing meth at 16.
How much of his drug addiction could be the guilt of killing
that
Tina?
Too. Yeah, absolutely.
Because he didn't, that we know of, if he did kill her, go on to kill anyone else. So
yeah, that's true.
Maybe this heavy drug use is because of the guilt you feel from
which
what you did.
To me, it's just so, which he didn't kill anyone else that we know of, but to stab someone 44 times, like this isn't like,
that's anger.
Yeah. Like that seems
And honestly,
extreme.
that's why it kind of makes sense if he's like, I was angry, I got locked in this dumpster, I was drunk, you looked at me wrong, and I was going for the first person that...
And you just set off in a rage, yeah.
Because it seems like a blind rage kind of thing, whoever did it.
Yeah.
But...
yeah, just super sad, and obviously her family has just been through so much, and
just so sad, just so I mean, all murder is unnecessary, but it's just like, again, just being like, oh, I'm just walking, I'm at the wrong place at the wrong time, and I encounter someone who decides to murder me.
Exactly. And again, like, it's just so crazy that it's literally in the middle of the afternoon. It's like 3:00, like right after school. And you're just like walking a route that you normally walk where there's usually other kids. Just insane that would happen right out there in the open. And
44 stab wounds, that would take a while for how deep they were. It's not a quick thing. Like, it's not a drive-by shooting.
Exactly.
It's at least a few minutes. Like,
yeah. Okay, yeah, well, that was really fucking sad. So, Courtney, what's your perk of the week?
So, my perk of the week, as I mentioned, I think while we were recording, is I made Kevin pick it. Did I mention that while we were recording?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
I made Kevin pick it. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure we went in the whole period talk.
Yes.
So, basically, I was like, what is my perk of the week going to be? And Kevin said, and I quote, I don't know. It's our anniversary week. Like, that was just like,
obviously.
No. And I said, I can't do one like ahead of time.
Yep.
And he was like, yeah, you can. So that's my perk of the week, is that Kevin and I have almost at this point been married for a full year.
Yeah.
So coming up on a year, and I'm just thinking back to like a year in the past, how, this is bringing flashbacks of recording multiple episodes within days, and preparing for a wedding
Mhm.
and preparing for a honeymoon and preparing for all of that and like the
Mhm.
stress that comes along with that, just those final days where you're like, what did I forget? And I hope everybody shows up that I
Yep.
paid to show up. So I'm at the vendors, not my guests. I didn't pay anyone to attend my wedding besides people who were getting paid a job.
Courtney's like, I paid my friends to come to my
I
wedding.
had to pay all my friends to come. I should have just eloped. But no, that's my perk of the week. And we're going to hopefully spend a nice weekend away.
Mhm.
And I'm very excited. So that's my perk of the week is I've almost been a married woman for a year now. So
I do have to ask, Courtney, did you save some of your wedding cake to eat on your anniversary?
did not.
Wow. Well,
Yeah. Well, you know, that's honestly, it's just from a little local bakery. Like I could just get a new one because that kind of sounds gross. Everyone I hear say it says it,
it's
unless my mom
disgusting.
somehow surprises me. But she took the cake home. From what I heard, they couldn't finish it and just threw it away.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. But no, I did order another cake though for us to enjoy this
Oh,
weekend.
that'd be nice.
So
And that'll probably taste a lot better. Because yeah, we
Yeah.
definitely ate our cake on our anniversary, which only did because my mom saved it. Like I would not have had the thought to save it.
Mhm.
But my mom like not only saved it, but then also like mailed it to me in dry ice since I lived 500 miles away at the time. So, you know, by the time it reached me, it was just a freezer burnt, gross, you know, piece of cake. And we each
That's
ate
what I
our
hear
one bite, and
everyone
that was it.
That's what I hear everyone say is they're like, it just tastes like freezer burn,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
But it's not good. So
Not worth it.
I don't think anything of it was saved, but we put a day between our wedding and our honeymoon, and that
Mhm.
still didn't feel like enough. Like you people who leave at like 7 a.m. the day after your wedding, I don't know how you do it
It's a lot.
because
Yeah.
I couldn't have done it. But yeah, no cake was saved. And unfortunately, I was upset about it at first. Now I don't care as much. I wish I had gotten my bouquet preserved
Yeah.
into like a picture. But then I don't know. I see other people talk about it, and I've heard people be like, well, when I shipped mine, it got destroyed in shipping. So I paid all this money and I didn't even get
Yeah.
anything anyway. And then I don't know. It's just a picture on the wall. Does it even really matter that? Would I even really look at it and like care that much?
Yeah. I just saved like the
Like,
ribbon from mine. Like I have pictures of what it
yeah,
looked like. I don't need to save it, you know.
yeah, it's fine.
Mhm.
But yeah, that is my perk of the week. Jacqueline, what is your perk of the week?
So my perk of the week is the book that I'm currently reading, which is Tiny Beautiful Things by Cheryl Strayed. So she is the one who wrote Wild, and this is basically her like advice column, Dear Sugar. So it's just a book of like this compilation of people who wrote into the advice column and like what her responses were, and it's just so beautiful. And they're short chapters, which, you know, Courtney and I like from previous book conversations. Like it's easy to just kind of fly through them. Also easy to stay up way too late reading because you're like, oh, I'll just read one more. Oh, I'll just read one more. And then you're like, it's been an hour. It's midnight. I got to go to bed. So
I know I saw a pretty late text come in from you
when
when
I
you
was
were reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like 11:39. I'm like laying in bed and I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna read one more of these, and then it just keeps spiraling. But it's really good, and it's, you know, some people write in who are like in situations that you've been in or that you're currently in, and then some of them are like, oh, I've never experienced that and I don't think I will. But also the advice she gives is just so like it could apply to other things that you could go, you know, it's really well done. I enjoyed it a lot and I really recommend it. So yeah, that's my perk of the week. And also kind of a two-parter perk of the week, which going into this, I was like, what's my one perk of the week? Because we literally recorded 48 hours ago. But my two-parter perk of the week is that this is the last book that I've had on hold for my ebooks because like, you know, 6 months ago, I put a whole bunch on hold and then of course they all come, you know, available at the same time. And then I have to like push them back and then keep and finally work my way through all of them. So this is the last of like the big bunch that I put on hold a few months ago. So, you know, it's time to go through again and put a bunch more on hold so I complain about it again.
I still have the same 10 that keep getting pushed back and pushed back. And
it's a vicious cycle. Yeah. Too many books and not enough time. We just need to quit our jobs so we can read books all day and then, you know, we still won't make a dent in them because
no, there's too many books in the world to read.
I also read something
Speaking
one time.
of, while recording this, I've gotten an email about 2 books that have come available just in the time of this recording.
That sounds about right. But I read something that was like, if you read, something about if you read like this many books like over this period of time, it comes out to like this many over a lifetime, or whatever it was. And I was like, that's all? I'm like, that's only like the number. Like, there's so many books out there, and that's all the ones we're gonna get to read because.
I know, it's insane.
Like thinking of like one day we're gonna die, and there's books that we're gonna want to read that we never got to read. Isn't that just so sad?
That is sad. All right, no, this is too sad on top of a sad episode.
I know. What kind of perk of the week
wrapping
was
this
that?
up?
Goodness. Okay,
Jacqueline, that was terrible. You did. Oof, you failed. F on that one.
Y'all, I screwed up this whole episode that unfortunately Courtney has to edit because I don't know. We've been doing this podcast for 3 years now. We've gotten in a groove. We've been doing great. I've not gotten the giggles in a long time, but then just something happened during our banter.
And it just
literally, we didn't even start the episode, guys. Like before I even read the sources, there's probably about 10 minutes that Courtney has to cut out where I just could not stop laughing. I had to cover her up physically with my hand so I couldn't like.
I even tried to turn my video off, and she was like, "No, that's worse."
Because then I would look at her and I would like see that it was turned off, and I know that it's turned off because I can't look at her without laughing, so that would make me laugh even harder. And then also poor Courtney, I had to clear my throat 500 times while I was reading because I had laughed so much before we started. Like,
so when this episode comes out, like a week after it's supposed to, you guys know why.
Or when this podcast ends, because Courtney's like, I cannot be your friend anymore because I hate you so much having to edit this episode.
No, I'll be fine. I'll get it through.
Oh boy.
But my laptop is at 10%. So we should probably
so we should just you guys know where to find us and all the things. Patreon.com/caffeinated crimes. You can get all kinds of bonus episodes and monthly hangouts and stickers and pins and just all kinds of goodies. And as always, please leave us 5 stars on whatever device app thing you can, because it is much appreciated and gets us noticed more. So please do that.
Yeah. And in the meantime, go have a cup of coffee.
And don't commit a crime.